Due Process, winner of 18 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights and the 2010 Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Best Discussion Series.
I need for somehow or some way for him to get help before his life is over.
Newark took a new approach in the fight against youth crime. The state got a new U.S. attorney. The U.S. Supreme Court got its fourth woman ever, with 3 now sitting simultaneously. And the state Supreme Court saw some controversial change, too. Those stories and more on part 2 of our annual look back on the year in justice. Up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. And by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by the PSCG Foundation and the Thomas and Agnes Carvel Foundation.
The year in justice, too active, too interesting for just 1 half hour. So welcome to part 2 of the Due Process Retrospective 2010. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and we start with what was surely the most explosive justice story in New Jersey this year. It concerned a new governor and a Supreme Court justice up for tenure, and fallout that continues to this day.
I, Johnny Wallace Jr.
do solemnly swear. And Justice John Wallace, himself just the second African-American to sit on the state Supreme Court, a position he could not have imagined as a 22-year-old graduate of the University of Delaware.
We attended football games together before, so I have great both personal and professional respect for Justice Wallace.
A position he would lose when a fellow Delaware alum forced him into early retirement.
Look at his overall body of work, that it represents a different philosophy, that philosophy being that it is okay to legislate from the bench. I don't believe it is.
It's just part 1 of the declared Chris Christie plan to shake up business as usual in New Jersey in the interest of change. In this case, step 1 in transforming what he sees as a liberal activist court.
So it would be completely inconsistent for me now as governor to reappoint someone who I believe participated in putting this court in a direction that I thought was inappropriate.
Those were fighting words in some quarters of the bar.
Quite frankly, I was appalled by that response.
And the bench and the civil rights sector.
To the NAACP, this is a slap in the face.
And what frightens me now is that there are a number of these things that I've talked about that are traditions, and that a first incursion is a frightening thing.
So the state Senate President, Steve Sweeney, struck back by refusing to even hold confirmation hearings on Ann Patterson, the governor's choice to replace Justice Wallace. And Chief Justice Stuart Rabner, having condemned the dumping of Justice Wallace, named the state's chief appellate judge to temporarily fill his seat.
But Raymond, the intrigue didn't end with the appointment of Judge Edwin Stern, who's been in the Wallace seat since September. Just before the High Court adjourned for the holidays, another justice who'll be facing the governor's decision on his tenure, Roberto Rivera Soto, made his allegiance known when he announced that he would neither vote nor participate in any court rulings because of his contention that Judge Stern's seating on the court, Raymond, wasn't constitutional.
And Sandy, the net effect of all these developments was to raise the most serious constitutional controversy since our new state constitution in 1947. On the one hand, you have accusations back and forth of political maneuvering around the judiciary. On the other hand, you have people saying this is not the same process that has caused the New Jersey State Supreme Court to be among the most widely respected in the nation. So this is a serious moment, although I'm not sure everybody appreciates how serious it is.
Yeah, and part of the departure is that this state Supreme Court and the executive had an unwritten understanding, unwritten traditions, as we saw former Chief Justice Porritt say, and that those were what kept the ship steady.
And that unwritten tradition was that at the end of the 7-year initial term of a Supreme Court justice, absent bad behavior, they'd be reappointed. Now, there are two other schools of thought on that. The second is Governor Christie's, which is, I have the same rights at reappointment time that I had at appointment time.
And I don't have to follow the unwritten tradition.
And our good friend Frank Askin from Rutgers University has yet a third point of view, which is Christie's right in theory, but he made a mad judgment here. All those things taken together have led to a great deal of controversy, and it hasn't been helped by the fact that the governor has been clear about what his political agenda is in terms of the Abbott cases and other cases that he cares about. And other folks on the other side have said, but doesn't this intimidate justices towards the end of their first 7 years into voting the way they think the governor wants in order to get reappointed?
This whole question of politicizing the court is so interesting because New Jersey's been proud that it doesn't have elected Supreme Court justices, or any kind of judges for that matter. Does this actually make us a little less pure than we've thought we were?
Well, let me give you the voice of not a New Jersey institution, but the Gray Lady, the New York Times, which just last week had an editorial mentioning the politicization of a respected court and criticized all the actors involved, all the people we've named. Senate Leader Sweeney, the governor, Rabner, and said everybody has participated in degrading the reputation of our court. And interestingly enough, Sandy, the subtext of that editorial suggests a kind of interesting solution. The court seems to feel that the governor should...
The New York Times.
Yeah, the New York Times seems to think...
Which, let me add,
Go ahead.
ends its piece by saying, and this is an editorial, interesting, a national paper, looking at our court so closely, the credibility of New Jersey Supreme Court must be protected. And you're saying that although the Times doesn't come up with a formula for protecting it, you think there is an unwritten message here?
If you read this editorial carefully, what I think you see the Times saying is this, that the governor should reappoint Wallace, that he should then appoint Patterson, the person he'd originally named for Wallace's seat,
but
to
not
Rivera
for
Soto's
Wallace.
Seat.
So don't reappoint Rivera Soto is what you think.
Exactly.
Is this your fantasy, or do you think this is actually what the Times is suggesting?
It's an interesting solution, but we also need a sea change in our understanding about how the political branches relate to the judicial branch. I went to law school in California, where all the teachers talked about this state Supreme Court in New Jersey as the most respected in the country. That's important for us, and we ought to get back to that point.
You believe it's less so right now?
I think the Times is right.
Well, with Chris Christie moving on to the State House, President Obama got the chance to name a new U.S. attorney for New Jersey. Enter Paul Fishman, an experienced presence in both private practice and federal prosecution, whose swearing in brought out a who's who in U.S. justice. As the Star-Ledger put it, events don't get much bigger than this in New Jersey.
I have every confidence that Paul will fulfill his responsibilities with his characteristic skill and determination and will be a superb United States attorney for this district.
And the names don't get much bigger either. From the Attorney General of the United States to the former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security to an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, thank you. It's truly a pleasure for me to participate in this very happy occasion today.
And from Fishman himself, what he pledges not to do.
Prosecutors have sometimes pushed the ethical envelope. And when that happens, every case in the country and every prosecutor suffers the consequences. In this district, on my watch, we will not be the ones to fall into that trap.
And what the office means to him.
My name is Paul Fishman, and I represent the United States. Thank you for coming.
And Sandy, what's been happening since that well-attended swearing-in ceremony?
Well, interesting. I emailed Paul, who's a good friend of both of ours, and said, you know, give me some high points of what you've been doing, or give me a call. Interestingly, I didn't get an email. and I didn't get a call. What I got was quite a formal response from his public relations person. And again, this is a friend of ours, but I got a formal response from the public relations person giving me a list of cases and outcomes, which I thought was very telling.
You know, it's interesting to wonder whether Paul Fishman, because he hasn't confided in us about this, is trying to set himself apart from his predecessor, because, as you recall, Governor Christie was a frequent guest on Due Process, talked to us on a regular basis, and in fact...
Not a shy guy when he was U.S. Attorney.
Talked to the media a great deal, and in fact, he talked so much that it led to charges that he was politically motivated. I wonder whether Paul Fishman, looking at that, decided that he's going to have a different style in terms of his office, and he's going to start by not talking to his old friends here at Due Process.
Well, it seems like that is the case, but Raymond, we have covered lots more than who's sitting in which of the state's most coveted seats. Among the stories we've told, the more than 1,600 New Jersey prison inmates confined in segregation, isolation, what used to be called solitary. And of the more than 300 men who've completed their sentences for sex crimes, but remain imprisoned indefinitely in civil commitment.
It happened in there. Most of the customers split. Those we could grab were holding inside.
All right, keep them cozy.
The world of crime and punishment. For generations, we've seen it each night on TV. So it's a world we think we know well.
Hey, Tommy Bell, NYU student.
If the transgressor's caught, there's a trial.
Mr. Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?
Yes, we have, Your Honor.
Or a plea, and depending on how that goes,
we find the defendant, Ross Morales, guilty.
A place like this, where the convicted is confined for the length of sentence, tempered perhaps by probation or parole, good behavior or bad.
Michael Dobson, you're under arrest.
But what you won't likely see on Law and Order
Don't do the crime if you can't do the time.
Is someone like Derek Sessoms.
I walk around with my head up high.
Who did the crime, did the time of 15 years, and maxed out in 2002.
They came and got me, didn't tell me anything, and in a matter of hours, they was bringing me in the same very room. They told me that I would only be here for probably 2 weeks.
Now, 8 years later, Sessoms
holding on to
is still locked up.
You holding me on what you think something I might do. There's nothing concrete. The only thing concrete is that I committed the act before.
Based on a sexual assault at 16, Derek Sessoms been classified as a sexually violent predator and confined behind barbed wire for as long as the state wants to hold him. And in the months since that report, there have been some changes. The Kearney facility closed, and the patients, or inmates, moved to the grounds of East Jersey State Prison. Among them, Derek Sessoms.
Any system that tries to predict future dangerousness is really problematic and flawed with inaccuracy, and will always compensate, that is, sweep in far more people than is necessary to achieve the ends. And I think that's evident in the case of Derek Sessoms, who committed this crime when he was a juvenile, and he's now 40. I think the system is deeply problematic, and I think it's unsustainable financially and legally over the long term.
One of the things that the state says about this whole question of civil commitment is they're not in prison. You've spent a lot of time in these places. You've had clients who were in civil commitment. Those of us who think we know, we really don't have any idea what's going on in there. Tell us.
Well, I hate the phrase legal technicality because I think it's used too frequently. But in fact, in this case, the courts have papered over a problem with the technicality. These men are involuntarily committed. They are not free to leave. They are effectively in prison. And in some of these facilities, they're being kept in places that used to be prisons. So to suggest that this is not incarceration is, I think, a fiction, which leads to other problems because they're kept indefinitely based on testimony or statements from basically state psychiatrists and psychologists. It's a very disturbing system designed to deal with a real problem, our growing awareness of how horrible sex crimes can be and that some people are inclined to commit more than one.
One of the most shocking things is a case like Derek Sessoms. He had other charges, and so he wasn't locked up in Avenel where the sex offenders go and supposedly get treatment. He's put in general population. He serves, he maxes out, and then the day he thinks he's going home, he's taken to civil commitment where he has languished for years. There seems to be something so horrible about that.
Sandy, I don't think that we should lose our impartiality here in due process, and I think this is a serious problem that we seem to sense more and more and know to some extent that some men are inclined to repeat sexual offenses. On the other hand, I don't think the science has caught up with that awareness, and so we've come up with essentially a warehousing system, which it seems to me is inconsistent with a lot of other principles we've held high.
The court in this state and the U.S. Supreme Court have said it's okay.
Repeatedly.
How is it okay? Again, I'm not losing my impartiality here, but explain to me how it's all right to spring this on someone, to not give someone treatment while they're incarcerated, and then say at the end of their incarceration when they've maxed out, you know what, you didn't get any treatment, so we're going to lock you up for another 7, 10, 12, 15 years.
Well, you're actually talking about a recent state Supreme Court case where a divided court affirmed a pattern that is really disturbing. A man goes to prison on a sex offense, asks for treatment, gets no treatment, and at the end of his prison term, he's civilly committed because he didn't have treatment. That's a catch-22 that's almost inevitable when you have a system like the one that's developing here. I don't think there's a clear answer, but the courts have said this is not criminal, there's no criminal stigma attached to it, there's no fixed term, and this is designed to deal with your health-related problems and to give you rehab, which is not the focus of the penal system primarily.
It would also seem to me that it wouldn't take that much intelligence to figure out what the state wanted to hear from you to show that you were rehabilitated. And so does this system also take advantage of the person who might be less intelligent, more naive, more honest? And the person who is perhaps a little bit more of a sociopath flies through, seems rehabilitated, and gets out while these other guys stay.
Psychologists claim they can detect malingering and things like that. I'm skeptical, and I do think that not only is it possible that there are people here that don't belong, but that there are people who might belong in some treatment facility who aren't getting the proper treatment. So this is a system that should disturb us all and that should be the focus of attention, because the truth is this is a population about whom no one cares except for the family members of these men involved.
Except that the society cares, as we know from all the Megan's Law machinations. The society cares about feeling that it's doing something about these dangerous sexual predators, and we know that they do exist. But another question that haunts me, when we did this program, it haunted me, is they say it's for the worst of the worst. It's for those who are most likely to commit the crime again. Do you feel secure in that?
I think
statement?
that's an unanswered question. It is the right question, because if you're going to have a system, however much we might criticize it, it ought to have the worst of the worst. And I've seen no evidence that shows a systematic look at how you would bring about this system with just the worst of the worst and those getting treatment. And we need to be asking that question, and we need to get an answer, not just from the Department of Corrections, but from the legislature and the governor.
Well, although the Supreme Court has said that civil commitment is not unconstitutional, there are those who insist it is unconscionable. And similarly, though the federal courts have one of the country's most famous civil rights lawyers facing what could amount to a virtual life sentence, there are those who call the imprisonment of Lynn Stewart a miscarriage of justice, while others say she's nobody's victim.
The case went to a jury, and the jury decided. That's the American way.
And 30 years of virtual life sentence was what Lynn Stewart faced when a federal jury in Manhattan found her guilty.
In ordinary times, this would not have been a criminal case, but these are not ordinary times.
Guilty of violating national security by carrying messages from a notorious convicted terrorist, Omar Abdelrahman, once based in Jersey City and dubbed the Blind Sheikh, held incommunicado in a federal prison. The government said her knowing acts to get his word out amounted to no less than treason.
Representing all of these persons that the government has declared to be enemies, so some of them very successfully, and so I was ripe for the picking, as they might say.
And it was all a far cry from the fresh-faced small-town girl who traded in the safe life as a school librarian for the passion and perils of a people's lawyer, one who'd come to the people's law school
to learn her trade.
So many good works. Should she be deprived of liberty for the rest of her life because she lost her sense of judgment for a moment?
And in the end, the judge said no, rejecting the government's call for 30 years, sentencing Lynn Stewart to 28 months.
This is a great victory against an overreaching government.
But in July, after a federal appeals court said her 28-month sentence was too short, the trial judge resentenced the 70-year-old Stewart to a decade in prison, a term her husband told us is a death sentence.
And I says, you know, Lynn, now we go back to the Second Circuit. You have an exposure of 30 years. And she looked at me and said, Ralph, little did I ever dream that I would be betting on Clarence Thomas to save my life. So I said, hey, Lynn, you know, like, that is funny. But, you know, like, I don't think that's... So this is her spirit. She's going straight ahead.
But Raymond, there seem to be deeper issues here about her whole sentencing structure in the Stewart case.
Yeah, this is going to be a challenging section for you and I because we both know and like Lynn and her husband. But
Indeed.
Underneath this is a change that's taken place in my lifetime of practice in both the state and federal system, where we have an offense-based system which looks primarily at the offense and only secondarily at the offender. And while there are many details involved in this, fundamentally, Lynn is being sentenced for the offense, and much of what she's done is not being considered as heavily as one might think.
Even though her trial court judge, in sentencing her, said he wasn't giving her the 30-year sentence that the government wanted because of all her good acts, because she had given so much of herself. Now the Second Circuit said, you're not allowed to do that.
Right. They reduced the importance of that. They also said she should be punished additionally for lying in her testimony, and they wanted to have her get an enhancement for the terrorist nature of her conduct. Those are things that wouldn't have happened before the federal sentencing guidelines, but they're there now, and they've resulted in a pretty serious
She also made a big mistake, which Ralph says she now realizes, and that is that because she's a woman with a lot of bravado, she said, 28 months? I can do 28 months standing on my head.
That was right after her first sentence, and you would think that a person with her experience would have known better than to effectively slap in the face the judge who's given you a pretty decent sentence, one that everybody could think was fair. On the other hand, I suppose it's easy to say that when you're not the person under that pressure. The judge, when he resentenced her, mentioned that, and in truth, he said it reflects a lack of remorse. And I think it's a fair inference, even though I don't like the sentence she got, and I'm deeply saddened by the consequences of this.
Yeah, I mean, Ralph does believe that if she has to serve this 10 years, of course, as you heard, he wants to continue to fight this thing and take it to the court if they were to be willing to hear it. But there's also the question of what Lynn has found out about what it's like to be in prison. And it's so interesting, Ralph says she now realizes nobody can do 28 months or any amount of time standing on their head. Federal prison is tough business.
Well, visiting prison is different from being there. I only know one side of that, but I know there's a difference. The other point, the other way in which this feeds into the story we've been looking at for a long time is the effect of the war on terror on the justice system, because I believe that before 9/11, this might not have been the same kind of result. But I think
there may not have been any charges brought against her, even though she violated rules, and she admits that she did. I think it's quite possible that she would have just been told, you know, Lynn, you're not allowed to do that.
We are living in a different age, and rightly or wrongly, and there are arguments on both sides, it changes the nature of the justice system because it has to respond to something it hasn't addressed before.
But Raymond, if the Lynn Stewart story was a sad one for those who thought an elderly, ill woman had been treated too harshly by the courts, another elderly, ill woman, one-time Rutgers Law School professor, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, found herself joined on the nation's top court by Justices Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. An unprecedented 3 women on a court that will continue to follow on due process. But with the uncertainty facing NJN, we're not certain what's next for due process. So please email us at dueprocesstv@gmail.com and follow us on Facebook.
For Sandy and for all of those who made due process a success, we're proud of all our colleagues, and the key ones we want to mention are Laurel Spira, Richard Kretschmer, Henrietta Parker, Tanya Ivanova, Pat Scanella, and so many, many others who've helped us earn 18 Emmys, 4 of them just this year. I hope for not the last time, I'm Raymond Brown saying goodbye. Thanks for watching.
look at his overall body of work, that it represents a different philosophy, that philosophy being that it is okay to legislate from the bench. I don't believe it is.
We make judgments and discretionary calls that have a profound and potentially devastating impact on people's lives.
I was a juvenile.
Still, Derek Sessoms, a plaintiff in the federal suit, is still insisting
that I should have never came here. I'm still fighting for my freedom to this day.
I said, I can be a lawyer, I can go to court, I can be one-on-one with these people, I can do some good, I can at least rescue one at a time.
A first incursion is a frightening thing. I no longer feel that I can take for granted the system that we have in New Jersey.
Major funding for due process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. And by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by the PSCG Foundation and the Thomas and Agnes Carvel Foundation.